The invitation sat in my inbox for 6 days before I opened it. I don't know why I waited. Maybe I already knew what was inside. Maybe some part of me recognized the email address, my brother's wife, Cassandra, and understood that whatever was in that message would require something from me, something I hadn't decided yet whether I was willing to give. I opened it on a Tuesday morning, standing in the kitchen of my apartment above the winery, still in the clothes I'd slept in. The harvest crew was already out in the rows below. I could hear the faint sound of voices through the window, the particular rhythm of people who know exactly what they're doing. The email was brief. Cassandra had booked Hartwell Estate Winery for their anniversary celebration. 240 guests, a 5-course dinner, a live quartet. The date was 6 weeks out. She'd gone through our events coordinator, a woman named Priya, who had no reason to connect the last name on the booking form to the name on the ownership deed. Cassandra had used her maiden name, Sloan, not Hartwell, not my brother's name, not my name. I read it twice. Then I set my coffee down very carefully on the counter and stood there for a moment looking out at the vineyard. My brother's name is Derek. He is 4 years older than me, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who takes up space in a room without seeming to notice he's doing it. Growing up, Derek was the one our parents talked about at dinner. His grades, his sports, his plans. I was the quiet one, the one who tagged along, who read books in the back seat of the car, who helped my grandmother in her garden on weekends because it was the only place anyone ever asked me what I thought. Our grandmother, Elaine, owned this land, 42 acres in the hill country, planted with Tempranillo and Mourvedre, and a small block of Grenache she'd put in the ground herself in 1987. She called it her insurance policy. She always said the land would outlast everything else. She was right. When she died, she left the estate to me. Not because I was her favorite, or at least not only because of that, she left it to me because 3 years before she passed, when the winery was hemorrhaging money and the bank was making calls, I was the one who showed up. I was 24 years old. I had saved $11,000 working 2 jobs after college, and I handed every dollar of it to her without being asked. I told her it wasn't a loan. She told me she would remember. My parents didn't know. Derek didn't know. No one knew except my grandmother and her attorney. When the will was read, my mother cried. Not from grief, from something closer to disbelief. Derek didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me across the room with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. It wasn't anger exactly. It was recalibration, like he was revising something he thought he understood. That was 7 years ago. In those 7 years, I had taken Hartwell Estate from a struggling family operation with a tasting room that leaked when it rained to a fully operational winery with events venue, a wine club with over 3,000 members, and a waitlist for weekend bookings that ran 4 months out. I had done this quietly, the way I do most things, without press releases or family announcements or asking anyone for their opinion. My family knew I worked at the winery. They assumed I managed it for some outside owner. I had never corrected that assumption. Not because I was hiding, the LLC was public record. The deed was filed with the county. Anyone who cared to look could have found it in 20 minutes. But because no one had ever cared to look. Derek, in particular, had never asked a single question about my work. In 7 years, not one. At Christmas 2 years ago, he told his college friends at the dinner table that his little sister worked at a winery. His tone was the same one he used when he told people his neighbor's kid had gotten a job at the mall. Fond, slightly pitying, deeply uninterested. I had smiled and passed the rolls. The email from Cassandra sat in my inbox and I thought about that dinner. I thought about a lot of things, standing there in my kitchen while the harvest crew moved through the rows below. Then I picked up my coffee and went to work. I didn't call Priya. I didn't flag the booking. I let it sit in the system exactly where Cassandra had placed it, confirmed and pending deposit. I told myself I was waiting to decide what to do. That was true, partially. But the other part, the part I didn't examine too closely, was curious. I wanted to see how far this would go. I wanted to understand exactly what my brother and his wife believed about me, about this place, about what they were entitled to. 6 weeks is a long time when you're watching something unfold. Cassandra paid the deposit without comment. 40% of the total, transferred from a joint account. She communicated only with Priya, selecting the menu, the table arrangement, the lighting package. She upgraded the floral order twice. She requested a custom label for the wine poured at dinner, the guest label program we offer for private events, where clients can put their own design on bottles from our reserve collection. She submitted a photo for the label. It was a picture of Derek and Cassandra on their wedding day, smiling, his arm around her. Her dress very white against the green of wherever they had gotten married. I didn't recognize the background. I hadn't been invited to the wedding. I had been in the middle of our first major harvest at the time, and Derek had told me, almost as an afterthought, that they'd decided to keep it small. There were 112 people at that wedding. I know because Cassandra posted every photograph. I approved the label design. I told Priya it looked beautiful. It did, objectively. The photograph was a good one. The week before the event, Derek called me. He called on a Wednesday evening while I was reviewing the seating chart Priya had sent over for the anniversary dinner. I almost didn't answer. I let it ring 3 times, looking at his name on the screen, and then I picked up. He wanted to know if I could come to the party. His voice was easy, the way it gets when he wants something and hasn't decided yet how to ask for it. He said Cassandra had found this great venue in the hill country. A winery, actually, he said, and I heard the small note of surprise in his voice, like he was still slightly impressed that his wife had pulled it off, and that it would mean a lot to have family there. I asked him what the venue was called. He paused. Hardwell something, he said. Hartwell Estate. It's supposed to be really nice. Cass did all the research. I said it did sound nice. He asked again if I would come. I told him I would be there. The morning of the event I was up before 5. Not because I was nervous. I wasn't, or not exactly, but because I am always up before 5 during event season. The estate has its own rhythm, and I have learned to move inside it. I walked the venue space before the setup crew arrived, the long stone terrace and the barrel room we opened for dinners, the south-facing lawn where we'd arranged the cocktail tables. The morning was cool and the vines were beginning to turn, edges of the leaves going amber and rust in the early October light. Priya arrived at 7. She was going over the final run of show when I told her, quietly, that the client for the evening's event was my family, my brother and his wife. Priya stopped typing. She looked at me. I told her they had booked under a different name and that I didn't believe it was intentional, which was only partially true, and that the event would proceed exactly as planned. Full service, full price, full experience. No adjustments. I asked her to continue handling the client communication as she normally would and to let me know when the family arrived. She nodded. She is very good at her job. She didn't ask questions. The guests began arriving at 5:30. I watched from the estate office, a room off the main corridor that has a long window looking out toward the entry courtyard. I recognized some of the faces, my parents, 2 of Derek's college friends, an aunt I hadn't seen in years. They moved through the courtyard with the particular ease of people who feel they belong somewhere beautiful, who have decided in advance to be delighted by everything. Derek and Cassandra arrived at 10 to 6. Cassandra was in a deep green dress, her hair up, and she looked genuinely happy. The kind of happiness that is also performance, that needs an audience to be fully itself. Derek was in a dark suit. He shook hands with the door attendant, said something that made the young man smile, and swept his arm out toward the estate in that way he has, a gesture of generosity toward something that isn't his. I stayed in the office. My mother found me 40 minutes later. She came through the side corridor looking for a bathroom and opened the wrong door, and there I was, sitting at my desk with a glass of Tempranillo and a seating chart. She stopped in the doorway. "What are you doing back here?" she said. I told her I worked here. "I know you work here," she said, the way people say things they don't actually know but don't want to admit. I meant, "Are you hiding?" I said I wasn't hiding. She looked at me for a moment with the expression she has worn my entire life, the one that means she is deciding how much of her actual opinion to offer. Then she said, "Come out and join the party. Your brother will want to see you." I told her I'd be out soon. She left. I finished the Tempranillo. I came out at 7:15 just as the dinner service was beginning. The barrel room was lit with the warm amber light we use for evening events, and the tables looked the way they always look when Priya runs a dinner, the kind of beautiful that seems effortless because so much effort went into it. The custom labels caught the candlelight. Derek's face, younger and laughing, repeated 42 times across the room. I stood near the entrance for a moment, watching. Then Cassandra saw me. She was at the head table, leaning toward one of her friends, and then she straightened and looked across the room, and her eyes found me, the way eyes find something that doesn't belong in a scene. The slight wrongness of it, the thing that makes you look twice. She excused herself. She came toward me with the particular walk of a woman who is trying to appear unhurried while moving with great purpose. She stopped about 3 feet away and looked at me with a smile that did not involve her eyes. She said, "I didn't realize you were working tonight." I said I was always here on event nights. She tilted her head. "I hope this isn't awkward," she said. "I didn't know you worked here when we booked. I hope you didn't feel like you had to, I mean, you didn't have to come out. We would have understood if you wanted to just stay in the back." I looked at her. I said I was glad she was enjoying the venue. Something moved across her face. Not quite uncertainty. Cassandra is rarely uncertain. But an adjustment. She said, "It's a beautiful place. We almost went with Purdian Hills, but the owner there is very difficult. Apparently this place is much more professionally run." I said I was glad to hear that. She looked at me a moment longer. Then she turned back toward her table. I found my parents near the bar. My father shook my hand, the way he has always shaken my hand, and asked how I was doing, and I said fine, and he said good, good. And then his attention moved on the way it always has. My mother had positioned herself next to her friend Patricia and was in the middle of a story. I stood there for a moment holding a glass of water, watching the room run exactly as it was supposed to run. Derek found me near the end of the cocktail hour. He was flushed from the wine and whatever ease comes from being at the center of a celebration held in your honor. He put his arm around my shoulders the way older brothers do, the arm heavy and proprietary, and said, "What do you think? Cass really knocked it out of the park, right?" I said the venue was beautiful. He laughed. "You should feel free to use your employee discount," he said. "Next time you have something to celebrate." I looked up at him. I said, "I don't have an employee discount." He shrugged. "Well, whatever, you know what I mean." He was already looking across the room. I said, "Derek." He looked back at me. I said, "Do you know who owns this property?" He blinked. "Some investment group, I think. Or a family. I don't know. Cass handled all of it. Why?" I said, "Look at the label on the bottle in front of you." He picked up the nearest wine bottle, one of the custom anniversary labels, his own face on the front of it, and looked at it. He read the back label the way people read things they aren't really reading, eyes moving without taking in. Then I watched him reach the bottom of the back label, where the producer information sits, where it is required by law to list the bonded winery number and the proprietor of record. Hartwell Estate Winery. Proprietor, Clara Hartwell. He read it once. He read it again. I watched his face the way I have watched weather come in over the vineyard, the way a whole sky changes in a matter of minutes. He set the bottle down. He said my name. Not in the easy elder brother way, in a different register entirely. I said, 7 years, Derek. He looked at me. He looked around the room, at the tables, the lights, the terrace outside, the vines on the hillside barely visible through the glass. He looked at all of it as though he were seeing it for the first time, which in every meaningful way he was. "You own this," he said. I said, "Grandmother left it to me." "She left it." He stopped. "When?" I said. "When she died. You were there when the will was read." "I remember the will," he said. I didn't know this was." He stopped again. He picked up his wine glass and then put it back down without drinking. I said, "The LLC is public record. It's filed with the county. It's been there for 7 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "You never asked. That landed." I watched it land. There was a long moment where we stood there in the middle of his anniversary party, in the middle of my winery, and the string quartet was playing something from the other end of the room, and people were laughing at nearby tables, and none of them knew that everything had just shifted. He said quietly, "Clara," I said, "the event will proceed exactly as contracted, full service, everything Cassandra selected. I want you to enjoy tonight." "I mean that." I paused. "But on Monday, I need you to come in and meet with me and my attorney because there are some accounting matters we need to discuss." The color that had been in his face from the wine and the celebration was gone. He said, "What accounting matters?" I said. "Your wife booked this event using a name that is not on the account and not on the credit card she paid the deposit with. The credit card belongs to a joint account you share with your parents. A similar situation happened with a catering bill from 3 years ago that was run through a vendor account my winery uses. I flagged both with my bookkeeper." I kept my voice even. "I'm not angry. I want to resolve this correctly. That's what Monday is for." He stared at me. I said, "Tonight, please enjoy your anniversary. You've been married 25 years. That's genuinely worth celebrating." I set down my water glass and walked back toward the office. Priya found me 20 minutes later to say the dinner service was running perfectly and the guests were delighted, and did I want to say anything from the floor. I said no. I told her to give the kitchen team my thanks. I sat at my desk and listened to the music carry through the walls. The quartet was good. Cassandra had good taste, whatever else was true. The Tempranillo the kitchen had poured for the main course was a 2019 estate vintage, one of the best we'd made, and I knew from experience that by the second glass the room would have that particular warmth that good wine in a beautiful place creates, the feeling of being held by something larger than yourself. I had built that feeling. I had built the room and the wine and the evening and the light. I didn't feel angry sitting there. I had expected to feel something sharper, vindication maybe, or grief, or the complicated satisfaction of being finally, plainly seen. But what I felt was mostly just tired, and underneath the tired, something steadier. Something that had been there a long time, quiet the way the vines are quiet through winter before they push new growth in spring. Derek knocked on the office door at 9:40. He came in without waiting for an answer, which is something he has always done. He sat in the chair across from my desk and he put his hands on his knees and he looked at me for a long moment without speaking. In the light of the office, he looked older than he does at family dinners. Smaller, maybe. Not smaller in size. He is still a large man, but smaller in some other dimension. He said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "You owe me more than that." He nodded. He said, "I know." I said, "Monday. Bring Cassandra." He said, "Cassandra doesn't know. About the credit card or the vendor account?" "She wouldn't have." He stopped. He started again. "She didn't know it was yours. Neither did I." I said, "I know you didn't." He looked at me. "Are you going to tell our parents?" I said. "I'm going to tell my attorney. What happens after that is between you and them." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you just tell us? All this time, Clara. Why didn't you just say something?" I thought about that. I thought about Christmas dinners and wedding invitations and phone calls that never came. I thought about 7 years of building something in plain sight while the people who should have been watching looked everywhere else. I thought about my grandmother's handwriting on the deed she'd had notarized 3 weeks before she died, and the way she'd said to me across her kitchen table, "You know what you're worth, Clara. You've always known. The rest of them will figure it out eventually." I said, "I shouldn't have had to say something. You should have asked." He didn't answer. There was nothing to say to that, and he knew it. He stood up eventually. He straightened his jacket. At the door, he turned back and said, "It's a beautiful place. What you've built here." His voice was different than it had been all evening. The performance of it was gone. She would have been really proud. I said, "I know." He left. I stayed in the office until the last car had pulled out of the courtyard and the cleanup crew had finished, and Priya had come to say goodnight. I walked the terrace one more time after everyone was gone, the way I always do at the end of an event night, checking the tables and the lights and the small things that need attending. The vines were dark against the sky. The air was cold and clean the way hill country air gets in October, and the whole property was quiet except for the sound of the wind moving through the rows. I stood there for a while. On Monday, Derek and Cassandra came in at 10 o'clock. My attorney was there. The bookkeeper was there. We sat at the long table in the estate office and we went through the numbers, line by line, without raised voices or tears or the kind of scenes that serve no one. The total, including late fees the attorney calculated per the vendor agreement terms, came to just under $19,000. Cassandra was pale but composed. She said very little. At the end, she looked across the table at me and said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." I said I believed her. The check was issued 10 days later. I deposited it without ceremony and put the funds toward the new barrel storage we'd been planning since spring. My parents called twice in the weeks that followed. My mother said she didn't understand why I hadn't told the family sooner about the winery. I said I had never been asked. She said that wasn't fair. I said a lot of things aren't fair and that I hoped we could have dinner soon, and I meant it. My father called separately on a Sunday morning. He didn't say much. He asked how the harvest had gone. I told him it was one of our best years yet, that the Tempranillo in particular was exceptional, that the winemaker thought we might finally have the vintage we'd been working toward for the better part of a decade. He said, "Your grandmother would have loved that." I said she would have. There was a pause. Then he said, "She knew what she was doing, leaving it to you." I said, "Yes, she did." He said, "I'm sorry it took us so long to see it." I held the phone and looked out the window at the rows, the leaves mostly down now, the wood going dormant for winter the way it does every year, the way it will come back in spring, the way it does every year. Patient and certain and unconcerned with anything except producing exactly what it was always going to produce. I said, "There's still time, Dad." And I meant that too. There's a version of this story where I walk into that room and announce myself, where I send an email the moment I see the booking come through, or make a phone call, or pull my brother aside at Christmas and say, "I need you to know what I've built." I used to think that version would have felt better. I don't think that anymore. What I've come to understand is that the truth doesn't need your help to arrive. It arrives on its own schedule, and when it does, it lands exactly as heavy as the silence that preceded it. Every year my family looked past me, every dinner where I was the afterthought, every assumption they made about what my life amounted to, none of that disappeared when Derek read my name on that bottle. But it was accounted for. Quietly, completely, without anyone needing to raise their voice. I think about what it actually takes to build something real. Not the celebrations, not the moments people see, but the years before any of that. When you are waking up before 5 in the morning and making decisions no one will notice and solving problems no one knows exist. That work doesn't ask for witnesses. It doesn't require an audience to count. It accumulates the way interest accumulates, invisibly and without pause, and one day the number is simply what it is. Clara didn't set out to prove anything to her family. That's the part I keep returning to. She wasn't building the winery as a rebuttal. She was building it because her grandmother trusted her with something worth protecting, and she was the kind of person who takes that seriously. The intelligence wasn't in the reveal, it was in the decades of quiet competence that made the reveal inevitable. You can't manufacture that moment. You can only earn it, slowly, in private. There's also something in this about what we owe the people who underestimate us. I don't think we owe them our bitterness, and I don't think we owe them our performance. What we owe them, if we owe them anything, is honesty. Which is what Monday's meeting was. Not revenge, not humiliation. Just a table, and an attorney, and a line-by-line accounting of what was owed. That's what integrity looks like when it stops being patient. Not loud, not cruel, just exact. The hardest thing, I think, is what Clara said to her father at the end. There's still time. That takes more strength than the reveal did. It would have been easier to close the door. To say, you had 7 years and you spent them not asking. But she didn't. She left the door open, because she is someone who understands that the people who failed to see you are not always people who meant to. Sometimes they were just looking in the wrong direction. The question is whether now that they've turned around, there is still something worth seeing together. I believe there is. I believe that's always worth finding out.